Well, that was a fun video. All right, guys, this is even more fun. Let's get into the meat of becoming a cybersecurity ethical researcher. No, I'm joking. All right, let's get into this. Okay, so the last video was a bit boring, but for I guess the purpose of this video was to understand some of the legality and laws and regulations within security. I mean, what are our boundaries? What happens if something occurs, etc., etc., etc. Now, let's get into the whole meat of this whole Inside the Mind of a Hacker series. Guys, let's begin. So we've already covered off the introduction of what it goes into the mind of inside the mind of a hacker. Let's now get into the terms, the methodologies, the approach, and I guess types of hackers. All right, let's begin. Okay, so first we have what we call hacking. And hacking just means, I guess one thing for me, hacking just means that it's basically getting access to a system and making it do what you want it to do. Okay, and I use this term very, very specific because it works. You know, as hackers, we're very curious. We want to pull things apart. We want to we want to see what else it can do, right? And that's what hacking means. It means having unauthorized access into a system, or authorized access, depending on what sort of scenario we're playing with. But it means altering that system to do something completely different to what it's intended to do, which is quite fun, right? So being curious about something, allowing something to, I guess, operate one way, but then we want to exploit that and make it do something completely different. So that's what hacking is. Then we have the hacker themselves, right? And then the hacker themselves basically fits into three basic categories. One is a black hat hacker, which is just basically malicious intent. You know, these are the bad guys. They just want to get access to a system, whether it's financial, whether it's resources, whether it might be gaining access to a particular company file or financial statements or records or anything like that. They usually do it with malicious intent. It's for the bad. It's not for the good. And it's basically 9 times out of 10, it's for fun, right? Then we have the white hat guy. The white hat guy is the good guy. He's trying to compete with this guy and try and block them out. But the white hat hacker has proper approval from organizations to hack into a system, whether it's what we call them a penetration tester or an ethical hacker. They have the proper legality and the proper scope of services to authorize them to attack or penetrate a system. Then we have a grey hat hacker, and the grey hat hacker is basically simple. It's a mixture of these two. You know, and most times, or I'd say at least a 9.5 out of 10, a white hat hacker is sometimes a grey hat hacker. He might use his, his good skills at work. He might be ethical during the day from his 9 to 8 o'clock job, go home, and then all of a sudden he becomes a black hat hacker, and then he tries to exploit companies by being malicious or with malicious intent. So a grey hat hacker is just basically a combination of the two. They usually sit in the middle of that. Whether they have access or they don't have access to a system, they'll just probably cause malicious intent. But I think most times a white hat hacker usually does cross the boundary into the black hat world. And who would say that it isn't true to do that? So it'd be quite fun. Some more terms is black box. Black box just means that you don't know anything about a particular system or a particular business. So let's just say, for example, a business comes to you and they say to you, "Hey, Michael, we want you to break into our systems." Right? That is awesome because you have no idea about any, business environments. You don't know anything about the production systems. You don't know anything about IP addresses, networks, systems, people. Then you're going to have to do your own research and reconnaissance to identify and footprint these systems, and then gain access to and maintain your access, and then cover your tracks to effectively be a black box assessment. Then we have obviously a grey box and a white box, obviously using these sort of terms as well. Grey box just means you might have basic knowledge about a system where if you have a network over here or a network over there, you might have actual access of this network, but then you have no information or no knowledge about that particular network. And then that's the scope. So they might give you the access to say, look, we want you to give us your vulnerability assessment of these two networks or full penetration test of these two networks. But you know what? We're going to give you information of this network, but we're not going to give you any information of that network. And we want you to see what you can find. Okay. And then white box just means you have full access to both of these networks. You've got a full written report that says, what systems you can test, what network IP addresses you can test, obviously domain systems, hosts, what you're not allowed to test explicitly. There might be a particular application or a network within this network that's probably running on some legacy applications, and if you try and penetrate that, that might cause a denial of service on the company, and obviously causing a big financial loss or business development loss. So therefore, obviously, it has to be written into a particular scope to say, look, you're allowed to test this. Oh, no way, you can't test that, and you can't test that, and you can't test this. So usually it's a piece of paper or a document about that big that says, here are all the systems that you can test. Here's what you can't test. Go have at it. Okay, some more terms. A vulnerability. Vulnerability comes from the Latin word vulnerabilities, which means basically an open wound. And vulnerability just does that. So let's just say you might have a network here, and you might find a particular vulnerability within that network or that specific device, or let's just say that device hasn't been rebooted in 5 or 6 months, and there's been 3 or 4 different patch levels out for that particular device because there's been a particular 0-day, which we'll talk about in just a moment, or a particular flaw in the operating system that's been developed in, and the company hasn't patched that system. So then we can find that vulnerability within that system or that, hardware device, and then we create what we call a proof of concept and we exploit it. So first we identify the vulnerability, what is vulnerable within this network, within this system, within this user, and then we try and actively exploit it. And then that's what an exploit is actually bouncing off a vulnerability. First, you have to find the vulnerability, you have to know what's vulnerable, and then you must go in there and attack the living life out of it. And that's what an exploit is. And then you might develop a proof of concept with it. Obviously, if you're an ethical person or an ethical researcher, you would develop a policy around that to say, look, this is a proof of concept. This is the device. This is how we exploited it. This is what you should do to mitigate it or to prevent it from having a penetration test and exploiting that particular device. Next is 0-day, or what we call O-day. And it just means that basically a 0-day is what we call who finds what first. Let's just say you have a particular appliance here, whether it's a Cisco device or another vendor device or a Citrix box or a NetScaler or whatever it might be. And let's just say there's a particular flaw in that operating system, and we find that flaw. We found that before anyone else. Okay, and a 0-day is one of the hardest things to detect because there are just so many different appliances out there, and for the life of it, it is very difficult to prevent or to mitigate these attacks because things are always changing, and things are always adapting to different versions, different operating systems, and you always have to patch things up, which is not the right approach to it, but that's the necessity of it. So it just means that there's a flaw in a particular operating system or within a particular hardware of the device, and you've basically found that first, and it can cause billions of dollars in, and I'll give you some examples in just a moment around an O-day that's happened as well. Next is a vulnerability scan. So in order to penetrate a network, you can do a basic vulnerability assessment. There are many companies out there, or many people, I should say, who buy very expensive devices to perform vulnerability scans, who then go off to their employer and show them that this is a penetration test. Now, that is not a penetration test. Penetration tests are 2 different things. A vulnerability assessment or a vulnerability scan just shows you what's vulnerable into a network, gives you a high-level overview of, the operating system, the patch levels, what could potentially be exploited. But it's not an actual penetration test because we haven't actively exploited a vulnerability within the vulnerability scan that we did. And next is a penetration tester. A penetration tester is, someone who has written an approval to break into a system. And there's a big difference between a penetration tester and what we call a red team. And a red team is my personal favorite. In just a moment, we're going to talk more about red team as well. So that's a penetration tester. They have written authorization from the organization to penetrate and break into the network, depending on the scope of service, having different IP addresses, different services that we can test, what we can't test, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Next, we move on to what we call insider threats. And insider threats are one of the easiest ways of breaking into a system, purely because it's just so easy to do. Well, we have what we call the first part is a dedicated insider. And dedicated insider just means someone that's within a company or an organization, and they've got, I guess, what we call physical access. You know, it could be Mary Jane or Bob Jane or whatever it is in the organization who have physical access to the building or to the facilities, or even to facilities or spots or places within the organization that other users or other people might not have access to. Let's just say, for example, you could be, and I guess this falls on the elevation, but if you're part of the IT team, you're going to have access to your little cubicle, which has all the routers and switches, for example, a little data center within the organization, right? And other people might have other access to other facilities, such as a cleaner might have access to the cleaning room. And then, when all the lights are out at night, they have access to the entire floor. So we'll talk more about them in just a moment as well. Then we have what we call log on, network login. So let's just say, for example, you and I both have access to log into a system. We now have authorized access over that system as well. Elevation is simple. You take a traditional user, then you have an elevated user, which is basically an IT person or someone who has more authority over someone else. For example, the CEO, the CFO, or maybe the entire C-suite will have more access to things, let's say, than a normal employee of the organization. So traditional elevation just means that elevated IT access, I think, is the greatest foundation of this, because IT teams have access to almost everything within the organization, and they can from there have a lot of insider threats occur, because we have such access to everything. And the most important thing is most companies should have what we call separation of duties, meaning that no one person should have access to everything. There should be specific separation of duties, which means it has to go through one person, has to go through another person, or another person, and then finally to another person. And then no one here has full access to everything. Each person has access to one specific thing within what they're entitled to do, for example. And that's basically it. Let's just say this person has access to create a user account. This person has access to delete a user account, and this person doesn't have any access at all, for example, right? And that sort of thing. Next, we have employees and contractors. So basically anyone that's an employee of the organization or a contractor of an organization. Let's say the building requires painting, for example, and then someone comes in, pretends to be a painter or a cleaner or something like that, and they got the proper swipe passes and the badges. That could be a potential social engineering attempt, which we'll talk about in the next slide as well. Then we have those types of people. So we have employees, we have contractors, anyone that sort of comes into our business placement of work or whatever. Then we have what we call greedy and disgruntled employees. And obviously greedy employees, let's say that they're ethical during the day, and then they obviously will use the best case scenario where someone might turn greedy for financial records, or someone within the IT team didn't get a promotion, therefore they're going to be greedy and they're going to try and cause an outage on the business because they have elevated access to something, and which requires more approval than most people. So then they can be disgruntled about it and be greedy about it, and therefore that potentially is an insider threat. Okay, so we need to ensure that our employees within the business have the proper authority to do their jobs. However, it won't cause harm or any sort of outage onto the organization and cause an insider threat, such as disgruntled or being greedy. Okay. More about insider threats. Next, we have what we call an insider affiliate. And this is quite simple. The most times we have a connection to the employee, whether we talk about someone's partner, their girlfriend, their boyfriend, their husband or their wife. And it's not very suspicious, whether, if the CEO's wife comes in every day to hand him lunch, for example, or they both go out to lunch together, or, the best friend might come in once every 2 weeks or once a week, and then we see that particular person every now and then, but we don't take that into account. We're thinking, oh, wow, that's Bob's girlfriend, or that's his wife, and that's okay, right? So that can be a potential insider threat because it's his girlfriend or it's his partner. We don't know that. Or maybe someone from the IT team is now talking to a really nice young lady or a man or whatever, And let's just say Billy there never had a girlfriend before, you know, he's never been married. All of a sudden now he has this lady who's now talking to him, an expression of interest, and now they're going out together, and she's spending more time with him in the IT department. He's showing her the systems and the servers and whatever. That can potentially be an insider threat as well, and we want to sort of stop that before it escalates too far. Next, we have visitor access. We discussed a bit about that before. Badges. Anyone who has any sort of badge access to an environment, such as an RFID tag to swipe into a building. Now, we're going to talk about some cool things later on, and one of them is bypassing RFID scanners as well. So if I'm an ethical person or an unethical person, I should say, I have a device that can actually clone and access those cards, and then I can pretend to be that person, have access to that building facility as well. And quite stuff. Next thing is some company equipment. Let's just say the company hands out mobile phones or laptops. And I was talking to a particular friend of mine maybe a couple of weeks ago, and he mentioned that NASA and some companies here in Australia, I won't mention them, but they're really large financial institutions, and they have at least 20 to 30 APTs every single day. And an APT means just it's an advanced persistent threat. And that means there's just either another company or a really large malicious sort of attack on these organizations coming in from external resources. And these people are highly skilled, I guess, hackers, right? And they have at least 20 at a minimum every single day. And imagine having 20 APTs every day. You know, you'd have to have a lot of resources and great talent to mitigate and prevent these attacks from occurring. Let's just say company equipment is a big one, because people take home laptops, people take home their mobile phones, and their mobile phones become one of the hardest things or one of the easiest things to compromise, therefore causing an insider threat of the organization or a company data breach, for example. And then it can potentially be a social engineering attempt. So someone's chatting to someone, for example, and you know they're pretending to be nice and they're carrying a pizza box, or they're trying to get access to a building or a facility by trying to maneuver the way in. For example, they got some coffee cups and they're trying to get access to a building, or the painters or janitors or whatever. So it could be potential a social engineering attempt as well. Now let's just go back to great hat hackers. Some types of hackers. We've talked about black hat. We've talked about basically them being crackers, or them sort of with a malicious intent. They're a malicious hacker. White hat hacker is basically ethical. He's doing the right thing. He's got approval. He's got permission to test the system. Grey hat guys are sort of in the line of these two. You know, obviously you need to know what's bad as well, so you can perform the good, and vice versa. Hacktivism. What on earth is hacktivism, and what is a hacktivist? Hacktivist just means they go against the political grain, so to speak. So let's just say there's a political campaign going on now, or you know the famous Donald Trump and what's her name, Hillary. And if a hacktivist doesn't like the opinion of that, or they have their own opinion of something, then they're going to hack into that system or that potential website or something, and then they're going to rewrite it or perform their own, I guess, opinion or their own view about a particular world thing that's happening right now, for example. I think there's been a recent example of that where, you know, they hacked into, I guess, the ISIS that has been going on over the last few years, and they were sort of hacking into them saying, look, if you don't stop what you do, we're going to expose all the records and all the details. And that's what a hacktivism is. A bunch of people that basically hack into a system with their own point of view. I guess it could either be good or bad, and then they'll have their own point of view on those political natures of events as well. A suicide hacker is basically simple. Suicide hacker is someone that just doesn't care if they get caught. There was a particular incident that happened, I think here in Australia, or maybe international somewhere, where there was a specific hacker who was working in an IoT company. And obviously IoT, you know, you have sensors and devices that are obviously connected to the internet. And they were a car manufacturer company. And these IoT devices, this particular IT guy, you know, placed these sensors into the cars where they'll monitor how many times you might press the brake or the accelerator, the petrol level or the gas level or whatever, the tire pressure, all that sort of stuff. It turns out that this suicide hacker was so disgruntled with his employer and the organization, he actually disabled the brake sensors. So therefore the brakes didn't work in those cars, which caused, you know, huge disruption across this manufacturing provider, and he was basically labeled as a suicide hacker, so to speak. He didn't care if he got caught. He just wanted to do it because, you know, hey, I have access to it and I'm going to do it and I don't care what happens. So next we have a script kiddie. Now, script kiddie is something that you do not want to be called. A script kiddie just means that you have no skills. You just use other people's software to break into systems. You can't do it by yourself. And, no hacker wants to be called a script kiddie. So if you have some friends that are trying to be hackers, call them a script kiddie and see how much fun you're going to have with that until they realize what it actually means. Okay. Next we have a phreak. And a phreak means they just basically break into phone systems and they have authority to tap into phone networks and make phone calls. And I think Kevin Mitnick, back in his good old day, he was an absolute phone freak. He'd tap into the entire, cellular networks over in the States, and then he would have full control and full access over the telephone records, so he can make phone calls, pretend to be an employee of the company or whatever, and we have actual records of those phone calls as well. Next is something that I didn't include on here in what I call a red team. And I said I'll talk to you guys more about that, or what we call a tiger team. And a tiger team is my absolute favorite component of being a hacker, because before we talked about, I guess, a what we call a penetration tester and a red team. And red team just means that a red team just means it's an unannounced security assessment. So let's just say the company has a CIO or a technology executive, and he says, look, we want to do a red team attack against our team, against our own infrastructure. So then you will have what we call a blue team, red team. You have scenario of the internal team of the organization. So let's say that's the business. And then they might engage in a third party of the organization, such as a red team attack. And then they'll have a red team, which might consist of maybe 5, 10, 30, 40, 50 people to try and break into the blue team's resources. So the web servers or the networks or systems or virtual systems, or even socially engineer their employees. And usually what would happen in a red team, most times there are no rules in a red team. So obviously there'll be a scope of services of what's the outcome of this attack and what's it going to look like. So the CIO would know what's happening. In most cases, maybe even the CEO would know. But employees or even the technical team within the organization wouldn't know that it's happening. It's an unannounced test to determine how fast and how quickly they can respond to a specific threat or an attack that the red team is going to conduct. So usually you have a team leader who's basically commanding the whole thing, and then he might have like a SQL person or a network guy or an application guy or a social engineering guy, and then they all report to him or whatever. And then they conduct that sort of red team attack onto the blue team, so to speak. And that is so fun because there are multiple ways of scanning networks, and we're going to talk about them as well later on, and how to crack into systems and break systems down and cause denial of service on attacks without even being detected, okay? And that's why it's my personal favorite, because there's no boundaries, there are no rules on what we can and what we can't do. And sometimes there's obviously always a scope. And usually when they conduct the red team attack, there's often approval from the tech leader or from someone who's in charge of the technology operations within the organization. Guys, this has been super fun. I hope you've had a basic introduction into the world of cybersecurity and ethical and unethical hacking. Guys, the next series is going to be absolutely fun. We're going to get more granular, more details of how to break into systems. Guys, this has been so much fun, and I can't wait till we get started with these new episodes. If you have any questions, I'd love to hear them. Let me know if you have any feedback. And guys, let's get stuck into the next episode right now.